February 1945, somewhere in western Germany. A column of German armor is moving through a narrow forest road near the Roer River. Inside the lead vehicle, a Tiger one, the commander scans the tree line through his periscope. 68 tons of steel, 102 millimeters of frontal armor. At this range, nothing the Americans have deployed in the European theater can threaten him from the front. He knows this. His crew knows this. The Tiger's 88mm gun had already turned 4 American Shermans into burning metal hulks that morning. Then, Sergeant Dean Kenney of the 605th Tank Destroyer Battalion gave one order. Not fire, not advance. He said, "Driver, move 6 meters left, behind the embankment, now." 2 seconds later, the M10 Wolverine fired once. The Tiger did not fire back. The M10 Wolverine weighed 29,600 pounds. Its armor was thin enough that a heavy machine gun could penetrate the sides at close range. German commanders had reviewed its specifications and dismissed it as a threat. One Panzer officer reportedly described it as a coffin with a gun. He wasn't wrong about the armor. He was completely wrong about what that gun and the men behind it could do when they understood something the Germans had never accounted for. This is the story of the American trick that turned an underpowered, under-armored tank destroyer into one of the most effective Tiger killers of the Second World War. And it had nothing to do with raw firepower. By the summer of 1944, the American Army had a serious problem. The M10 Wolverine had entered service in 1942 as the primary tank destroyer of the U.S. Army. On paper, it looked like a reasonable answer to German armor. It carried a 3-inch M7 gun, a weapon capable of 2,800 feet per second muzzle velocity. It was fast for its class, mobile, built on a modified Sherman chassis. But by Normandy, the battlefield had changed. The Wehrmacht had deployed 2 vehicles that broke every assumption the M10 was designed around. The Panther. 80 millimeters of frontal hull armor, sloped at 55 degrees. The Tiger one. 102 millimeters of flat frontal armor, no slope needed. The M10's standard armor-piercing round, the M79 AP shot, could penetrate 93 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 yards. Against a Tiger frontally, at the distances where combat typically happened in the bocage and the German countryside, the math was brutal. 93 millimeters of penetration, 102 millimeters of armor. The M10 was firing rounds that would not go through, and the Tiger's crew knew it. 88mm gun. Muzzle velocity, 2,657 feet per second. Penetration against the M10's 37 millimeters of frontal armor at 1,000 yards. Complete. At 2,000 yards. Still complete. The Tiger could kill an M10 at ranges where the M10 could not even injure the Tiger. American tank destroyer doctrine from 1941 had been built on an assumption that a fast, mobile anti-tank gun could defeat any armor by outmaneuvering it. That doctrine had been written before the Tiger existed. By the fall of 1944, the men of units like the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, who would go on to become the highest-scoring tank destroyer battalion in the entire European theater, were going into combat in vehicles that could not reliably kill the vehicles they were being sent to stop. Critics at the time, and historians afterward, have pointed to this as evidence that the entire tank destroyer concept was flawed. They were right that there was a problem. They were completely wrong about where the solution would come from. To understand the trick, you have to understand what the M10 actually was. Not on paper, but as a machine. The M10 was built on a widened M4A2 Sherman hull. Its turret was open-topped, a decision that drew criticism then and now, as it left the crew exposed to artillery fragments and small arms fire from above. But that open top was not an oversight. It was a weight calculation. The M10 weighed 29,600 pounds loaded. Compare that to the Sherman's 33,000 to 38,000 pounds, depending on variant. The M10 was lighter because every pound of removed armor was a pound of mobility. And mobility, as it turned out, was the only answer to the Tiger problem that actually worked. The turret could traverse 360 degrees. The vehicle carried 54 rounds of 3-inch ammunition. Its engine, a twin General Motors diesel in the M10A1 variant, gave it a road speed of 30 miles per hour. In a straight fight, hull to hull, frontal armor against frontal armor, the M10 lost, every time, without exception. But the men who were actually fighting in these vehicles, crew commanders, platoon leaders, battalion commanders in the field, had begun working out something that no test range had revealed and no doctrine manual had anticipated. The Tiger was not invulnerable. It was specifically vulnerable, and the vulnerability had a precise location. The Tiger I's armor was not uniform. This is the fact that changed everything, and it was learned not from intelligence reports or engineering documents, but from American tank crews examining destroyed Tigers after combat and measuring what they found. Frontal hull, 102 millimeters. Frontal turret, 100 millimeters. Side hull, 82 millimeters. Rear hull, 82 millimeters. Rear turret, 82 millimeters. Top deck, 26 millimeters. Engine deck, 26 millimeters. The Tigers' designers had built a fortress facing forward. Against frontal attack, it was nearly impenetrable to anything the Americans were deploying in large numbers. But the sides, the rear, the engine deck, these were different numbers entirely. The M10's standard M79AP, round at 500 yards, could penetrate 106 millimeters of vertical armor. At 500 yards against the Tigers' 82 millimeter side armor, it went through. Not barely. Through. And then, in September 1944, something arrived in theater that changed the equation entirely. The T4 shot, later standardized as the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. HVAP was not a larger round. It was not a more powerful charge. It was a different physics problem. The M93 used a tungsten carbide core, a material nearly twice as dense as steel, seated inside a lighter aluminum carrier. When fired, the aluminum carrier fell away after leaving the barrel, leaving the dense tungsten core traveling at significantly higher velocity than a standard steel projectile of the same caliber could achieve. Numbers. Standard M79 AP round. Penetrates 93 millimeters at 1,000 yards. M93 HVAP round. Penetrates 135 millimeters at 1,000 yards. 135 millimeters. The Tiger's frontal armor, 102 millimeters. With HVAP ammunition in the breech, an M10 Wolverine could kill a Tiger frontally from 1,000 yards. The weapon had existed. The ammunition had taken time to arrive. But ammunition alone was not the complete answer, because HVAP rounds were rare. Each M10 received only a handful, sometimes as few as 6 to 12 rounds per vehicle at the time of initial distribution. 6 rounds, against a Tiger that typically operated in platoons of 3 to 5 vehicles. This meant the trick was not just the ammunition. The trick was knowing exactly where to aim, exactly when to fire, and exactly how to position the vehicle so that one shot or two was enough. The technique that developed, tested in combat, refined through failure and survival, combined 3 elements. First, positioning. M1. O crews learned to never engage a Tiger from the front unless HVAP was available and the range was under 600 yards, where penetration was guaranteed. They moved. They used terrain, ditches, embankments, buildings, tree lines, to approach from angles where the Tiger's side armor was exposed. Second, timing. The Tiger's turret traverse was slow, hand-cranked at approximately 6 degrees per second in many conditions. A Tiger commander who spotted an M10 on his flank needed roughly 15 seconds to bring his gun to bear on a target 90 degrees away from his current position. 15 seconds was enough time to fire, begin repositioning, and break the firing line. Third, the point of aim. Crews were trained, through formal instruction and through battlefield experience shared between units, to aim for specific zones. The lower side hull, beneath the turret ring, the rear hull where the engine compartment was covered by only 82 millimeters of armor, and the engine's own heat created additional vulnerabilities. The junction between the turret and hull on the side aspect, where the armor met at an angle that reduced effective resistance. None of this was in the original doctrine manual. All of it was worked out in the field, by men who survived long enough to learn and communicate what they'd discovered. Sergeant Dean Kenney of Company A, 605th Tank Destroyer Battalion, arrived in Europe having trained at Camp Hood, Texas, the home of the Army's Tank Destroyer branch. His M10 was armed with a 3-inch M7 gun. His crew had rehearsed the doctrine. They understood the vehicle. What no training at Camp Hood could fully prepare them for was the reality of the Roer River campaign in February 1945, supporting the 78th Infantry Division's drive into Germany. The German defense relied on Tiger and Panther tanks used as mobile strongpoints, positioned to cover road junctions and river crossings, waiting for American armor to appear in their fields of fire. Kenney's crew did not appear in their fields of fire. They appeared on their flanks, using the terrain, moving on secondary routes, waiting for the moment when a Tiger's attention was fixed on infantry or another vehicle, and then firing from the angle where the armor was 82 millimeters instead of 102. Where the HVAP round had 53 millimeters of margin instead of a deficit. The story of the 605th is one data point. The unit that built the largest documented record was the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Activated on July 25, 1942 at Camp Carson, Colorado. Landed at Omaha Beach on June 24, 1944. Fought from Normandy through the end of the war in Europe. By the time the campaign ended, the 823rd's after-action reports, now archived and available at the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth, documented the destruction of 113 German armored vehicles. Among them, 27 Panthers, 18 Tigers destroyed by a battalion operating M10 Wolverines, Vehicles that, according to the standard armor penetration tables, could not reliably kill a Tiger with their standard ammunition. The 18 Tigers weren't killed with standard ammunition and frontal attacks. They were killed with positioning, timing, and when available, HVAP rounds applied to the specific 82mm sections of the vehicle's armor that the Tiger's designers had considered secondary. At the Battle of Mortain in August 1944, the 823rd, still equipped with towed 3-inch guns at that point, held defensive positions alongside the 30th Infantry Division against a major German armored counterattack. They destroyed 14 German tanks before being overrun, losing 11 guns in the process. Not a clean victory, not without cost, but 14 tanks destroyed with equipment that could not penetrate the frontal armor of the vehicles attacking them, because the crews knew exactly where to shoot and waited for exactly the right moment to shoot it. A German account recovered after the battle noted that American anti-tank fire seemed to be coming from positions that changed location between shots, a tactic that confused German tank commanders who expected the weapon to fire from the same position twice. It didn't, because the entire doctrine, as it had evolved by 1944, was built around the principle that the M10 could not survive a sustained exchange. It had to kill in one shot or two, then move before the return fire arrived. One shot, move, one shot, move, shoot, and scoot. A phrase that sounds simple and conceals inside it an entire philosophy of asymmetric combat that the M10 crews had developed because staying still meant dying. What makes the M10's combat record historically significant is not simply the numbers. It is what those numbers forced the German command to do in response. By late 1944, Wehrmacht armor doctrine, which had been built around the assumption that the Tiger and Panther were essentially immune to Allied anti-tank fire at standard combat ranges, had begun to change. German tank crews started being briefed on the existence of American HVAP ammunition. They were told, accurately, that it could penetrate the Tiger's side armor at combat distances. The response was not a technical fix. It was a tactical one. Tiger and Panther crews began avoiding exposed flanking positions. They reduced the distances at which they would engage to minimize the time American vehicles had to maneuver into advantageous angles. They operated in tighter mutual support formations so that one tank could cover the flank of another. In short, the Germans changed how they used their best tanks because of what the M10 crews had discovered. Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy, wrote in his memoirs that by the summer of 1944, German tank commanders had been forced to assume that Allied anti-tank weapons could find a way through, even when the standard armor tables said they could not. The psychological effect was as important as the physical one. A Tiger crew that is watching its flanks, moving carefully, uncertain whether the vehicle appearing at its 10 o'clock has HVAP in the breach, is a Tiger crew that is no longer fighting at its full effectiveness. Fear of what might be in the breach is tactically almost as valuable as what is actually there. The deeper lesson of the M10 Wolverine's record against the Tiger is not about ammunition specifications. It is about what combat actually reveals versus what peacetime engineering predicts. The M10 was declared inadequate by officers reviewing its penetration tables against German armor in the fall of 1944. They were correct that the numbers were insufficient for a frontal engagement at standard range. They were wrong that the numbers were the whole story, because numbers describe a vehicle fighting the way its designers assumed it would fight. They do not describe what happens when the men inside it are intelligent, resourceful, and motivated enough to find the situation where the numbers stop mattering. The M93 HVAP round existed because American ordnance engineers understood that the tungsten core could solve the penetration problem. But the HVAP round alone, fired from the wrong angle at the wrong moment by a crew that sat still waiting for a second shot, would not have produced 18 Tigers destroyed by a single battalion. The ammunition was one component. The doctrine, developed under fire, shared laterally between units rather than handed down from command, was the other. Republic Aviation did not design the P-47 Thunderbolt to be a tank killer. Pratt & Whitney did not engineer the R-2800 engine for low-altitude strafing runs. But pilots in the 9th Tactical Air Command found what the airframe could absorb and built a method around it. The same logic applies to the M10. Chrysler did not build the Wolverine to kill Tigers. The Army did not design M10 doctrine around HVAP ammunition that didn't yet exist. But the men in the 605th and the 823rd and dozens of other battalions found what the vehicle could do, worked out the geometry of the Tiger's armor, and built a method that extracted maximum lethality from a platform that was never supposed to be sufficient. Sufficient for what? To survive a frontal exchange at long range with a 68-ton German tank? No, the M10 was never sufficient for that. But sufficient to put a tungsten core through 82 millimeters of side armor at 500 yards, while a Tiger commander was still turning his turret hand crank, trying to find the vehicle that had just fired at him from a position it was no longer in? That was a different question. And the answer, built from combat experience and shared between crews who couldn't afford to be wrong twice, was yes. Sergeant Kenney's Tiger near the Roer River did not survive the engagement. The M10 had moved 6 meters to the left behind an embankment that gave the crew a partial defilade position. Hull down, with the gun exposed, and the thinner side of the Tiger visible at an angle of approximately 70 degrees from the vehicle's front. The M93 HVAP round in the breech that morning would penetrate 135 millimeters at 1,000 yards. The Tiger's side armor at that angle was the equivalent of 82 millimeters of resistance. The range was under 400 yards. There was no question about what the round would do when it arrived. There was only the question of whether the crew could get into position, fire, and move before the Tiger's commander found them. They did. The Tiger's engine compartment caught fire within seconds of penetration. The crew bailed. The vehicle was abandoned. Kenney's M10 was already repositioning before the fire reached the ammunition. What the Germans had dismissed as a coffin with a gun had put a round through the side of a vehicle they considered invulnerable, using a piece of ammunition that hadn't existed 6 months earlier, aimed at a section of armor that the Tiger's designers had considered a secondary priority, fired from a position the M10 had moved to while the Tiger was watching somewhere else. Not exotic technology, not a secret program developed over years in a laboratory. A few rounds of tungsten core ammunition. A crew who knew their vehicle's limitations well enough to never let those limitations be what decided the fight. And the discipline to move after every shot, because staying still was the only thing that could actually get them killed. That, precisely, was the American trick. Not the round, not the vehicle. The understanding that a weapon is only as limited as the tactics built around it, and that the men who survive long enough to build better tactics are the ones who change what the word sufficient means.